Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Water Resources Research Center's Water Webinar, Global Water Bankruptcy, Living Beyond Our Hydrologic Means in the Post-Crisis Era. I'm Sharon Megdell. I'm Director of the Water Resources Research Center. I'd like to, again, welcome all of you. Ask that you please mute your microphones if they're not already muted. We will have a presentation after which I will moderate the Q&A. So as questions arise, please enter them into the chat. We will be recording this presentation and posting it to our website. All of you who have registered for the webinar will be notified of the posting of the recording. And we do go for an hour and 15 minutes total. I don't know what time zones you're all in, but it's now just afternoon here in Arizona, and we will go as late as 1:15. I do want to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Otham and the Yaqui. The university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. I do want to note we have a couple of upcoming events noted on the slide in front of you. The end of this month, we're going to be presenting the Arizona Water Conservation Fact Sheets. It's a project funded by the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority. We have a co-sponsored event about growing water smart in Arizona and Colorado. And then we have another webinar in August scheduled. So it's a busy summer. We're not taking much of a break here. And I do want to note that today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Women in Water Diplomacy Network. We very much appreciate that co-sponsorship and the membership from the network here with us today. So it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today. Professor Kaveh Madani is a distinguished environmental scientist, educator, and leader, renowned for his interdisciplinary approach to addressing complex environmental and human security challenges. He is an expert in complex human natural systems modeling, integrating mathematical, economic, and systems analysis models to derive actionable policy insights. Professor Madani currently serves as the director of the UN University Institute, and it's given me the acronym, which I'm not going to remember. It's Water, Environment, and Health, or Environmental Health. You'll have to correct me when I get there because I didn't realize I just had the acronyms here. And it's known as the UN's think tank on water. He's the author of Global Water Bankruptcy Report that we'll hear about today. And he was recently named the 2026 Stockholm Water Prize Laureate, which is the world's most prestigious award for outstanding achievements in water. So we're just so honored and delighted that you've joined us today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Madani, for your presentation. I'll come back after you're finished and moderate some Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sharon. It's an honor to be here and speaking with your audience. I've never had the pleasure of visiting your university. That's a shame, but I look forward to that. Hopefully that can happen someday, but I think the virtual presentation is as good. I just need a confirmation that you can see my screen. See my slides in the presentation mode, not the presenter.
Not yet in presentation.
You're not.
I'm seeing the slides on the left. I think you just need to go show slides. Yeah.
Let me try this one more time.
Yeah, I wasn't seeing the version that shows the two slides next to each other, but you just got to go into start the slide show.
Yeah, and
up at the top, slideshow.
I had it, but I lost it. So hold on a second. Let me see if I can fix that. Slide control show meeting. Before it was giving me the option of swapping. but it doesn't now. Hold on, it's now here.
No, you were in the right one before. You just weren't in presentation mode. So I think if you go up there, yes, now you're there. Perfect.
No? Yeah.
Yes, now we're there. Great.
All right. All righty. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to talk about a report that came out earlier this year. You did a very good job in guessing the acronym. So the N there is very confusing, but Water, Environment, and Health is the acronym. So this is the institute, one of the institutes of the United Nations University system that is responsible to cover this big and broad portfolio. And water has traditionally been the biggest part of our portfolio. We are headquartered in Toronto, Canada, and the government of Canada has been our generous host for the last 3 decades. And indeed, this year is our 30th anniversary. In January 20th, this year, on the 20th, we published a report that warned the world about the entrance of the world into an era that we name as global water bankruptcy. A day before that, on January 19th, there was also a paper in the Journal of Water Resources Management explaining this concept scientifically in detail, but we are going to go over it now as I speak about some of our messages and warning. So the report, if you look at it, did not say something that we did not know. But I think it did one job very well, probably, and I'm really biased maybe as the author of the report, but I think the report just brought everything we knew under one umbrella and gave it a new framing, and that's why it was a little impactful, because it got us think, and it did a job of explaining the different symptoms of a problem that we call water bankruptcy, and highlighting that we are all in it together, whether you're in Colorado River Basin or here in Ontario near the city of Waterloo, which is an hour from us, or where I come from, Iran, and these symptoms are there, and they're very serious. So it talks about all these statistics that are very drastic, very dramatic, and it talks about the different symptoms of the water bankruptcy problem. It makes it very clear that still billions in the world remain water insecure. We have not made enough progress on the SDG 6, the SDG for water. Still, a lot of people around the world don't have access to clean water for drinking and sanitation. This is something that the world has been speaking about. We all know that we have to provide water, drinking water, clean drinking water. That's a human rights. That's the first stage of development. But even after that, the problem doesn't stop. We have many places around the world that have clean drinking water, but when it comes to other activities, there is water scarcity. So that's why for a few months, or at least 1 month a year, billions of people around the world are in the water insecurity state. They're suffering. Water scarcity is a major crisis for them. Surface waters are shrinking around the world. Rivers are getting smaller. Some wetlands are drying up, and what we call the checking account is
You muted yourself by accident. After you said checking account, we stopped hearing you.
Yeah, I didn't touch it, but something must have happened, or the host must have been has muted me. Now tell me what you see.
Well, now we're back on the wake up call slide. So I think
Presenter mode or presentation?
in presentation mode, it's fine.
Okay.
Except that, yeah, continue to share. I think you just, oops, your slides are advancing somehow.
It's
Okay, let's go back. Yeah, we're good, I think.
Mhm.
For some reason, there's
Can you
this
hear me?
little thing, continue to share this PowerPoint window. Do you see that on your screen? Just say continue to share. I think, I think,
That's a problem. When I click on that, it changes my slide. So that's why.
oh, wow, this is weird.
Yeah. Are we? So what do you see now?
We're seeing two screens of yours.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, now we're good. Now we're good.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So our chicken account is declining. Wetlands and lakes around the world are shrinking, but the problem is not just its chicken account. Below the surface, groundwater depletion is continuing to happen in many parts of the world. Land subsidence is becoming more widespread. On the right side of this slide, you see a sinkhole in Turkey. Just last year, there were a report on 700 of these sinkholes appearing in an area where there is a lot of agricultural activity. On top of this, we have glaciers and other savings of humanity that continues to melt and decline. Around the world, we see agricultural heartlands, the food baskets of the world also being threatened. That's a major security risk for the whole world. It can result in starvation. It can manipulate the food prices around the world. And this is a major issue. Land and soil degradation continues, and the report tries to establish the connection between water and soil and why that is important and why water damage is soil damage and why soil damage is water damage. Droughts are becoming frequent, of course, with climate change more intense, longer as well. The problem is that they're even becoming more anthropogenic. So meaning that even during the wet years, our droughts don't go away, our reservoirs are empty, our soil moisture is low. Even some wet years cannot compensate for the past drought, and we are continuously getting stuck in that mode. Water quality degradation is another challenge we're facing, and it's becoming worse and worse. The report establishes another, I would say, fact or reminds us that water bankruptcy is not only about quantity, quality is also a major issue. In many places around the world, we have water on paper, but the quality of that water is not good to use. Of course, the groundwater decline and surface water decline contributes to that. But in some places, we have still plenty of water, but that water is polluted and not ready to use. So we are seeing ecosystem degradation. We are seeing more wildfires. We're seeing sand and dust storms, more dry lakes, more desertification in many places, and so on. And ecosystem degradation in many places mean or give us signs of passing the tipping point. So the systems can no longer bounce back to where they were even when in the wet years. And we are seeing also increased in the frequency and number of water conflicts between different users, urban environments, farming communities. Now data centers being added to the mix, but we also see at lower scales among farmers and rural communities conflicts between indigenous communities and other sorts of users, especially urban communities, and also between nations or states and so on. So Colorado River Basin is again an example of seeing conflicts at different levels when it comes to water users, and it's not always between nations, but it can happen at lower levels. And then I think we can conclude that the institutions we have in place, the regulations we have, the treaties we have in place, and the governance mechanisms and the guidelines we have starting from the UN system to going down to all different levels are not sufficient to deal with this new reality of the world. Some of the treaties, some of the agreements, some of the institutions were built when the hydrological conditions were different, when the socioeconomic conditions were different. That's why they're not adequate to address the current concerns and deal with the current systems. Even our infrastructure were built many years ago where the systems were different. We built those based on stationary assumptions, stationarity assumptions, and they're no longer valid. That's why we cannot deal with these problems we're dealing with these days. Now, okay, what happened? Okay, so now we are dealing with the problem that we call water bankruptcy. When we say the world
Sorry,
has,
Kaveh, I'm just sorry. We're still having, we're seeing two versions. We're seeing the screen. Now we're back to the right one.
okay,
But sorry.
okay, no worries. So we are saying that we are in the era of global water bankruptcy. When we say
I'm sorry for the interruption again, but that second screen keeps coming up of yours. It's when you have it, when you're editing your slides. We're seeing a version that has the last slide, yet behind it we're seeing the right slide that says,
Yeah, if you can just drag it off, I think
yeah,
that would
drag
be
it
ideal.
off. That might be
are
the
we good
solution.
now or no?
Yeah, yes, now we're seeing your right slide. Sorry for all the
No,
interruptions.
no worries.
Yeah.
No worries. So we call this water bankruptcy, the era of global water bankruptcy, but we insist that when we say the era of global water bankruptcy has come, it does not mean that every system, every river basin, every city, every aquifer around the world is water bankrupt. It means that we are seeing more and more systems around being pushed into the water bankruptcy mode. And now let's define water bankruptcy. So water bankruptcy, as the name might imply, it should be about the misbalance between the income that we have and the expenditure. Our use being more than supply for an extended period, meaning that the system is suffering from insolvency. Water income is systematically lower than the water expenses. On one side, we have the surface water systems and soil moisture as our checking account. So that includes also our snowpack that is becoming more and more limited, but that checking account gets renewed by nature. Climate change is making that more limited in some parts of the world. We also have our savings account. The yellow tags are showing the savings account, the aquifers and glaciers. They're becoming more limited. And then on the right side of this conceptual framework, like this image you are seeing, the uses that we have. So agriculture is still there, and across the world, we are talking about 70% of the world's water withdrawal being for the agriculture sector. But we have also urbanization continuing, more and more consumption in the urban sector. Urban areas come with a lot of use, and then improved quality of life means a lot of water use in the urban sector. Industrial sector also continues to expand indeed with improved economy. We see that sort of expansion. Energy is a backbone of that. Energy use continues. Hydropower, not only hydropower is energy consumptive, water consumptive, but other sorts of energy uses are also dependent on water. Now we are also having AI and a new sector that it also requires a lot of water. Actually, last week we published this report on the water footprint, carbon footprint, and land footprint of AI's energy use, just showing what the numbers are and how significant those numbers or the new demand is. But water bankruptcy is not only about insolvency, because you can be insolvent. It means that your consumption can be more than the available water. How? The renewable fresh water. How? You can afford it when you continue stealing from nature and you continue using your savings. You can exhaust your saving. That's one side of the story, but you also can steal from nature. And nature is resilient to an extent, can tolerate this pressure, can live with that pressure, but after a while, you see signs of irreversibility. For a water bankruptcy state to emerge, you have to have both conditions in place: insolvency plus irreversibility. You can be an insolvent system, but you're not necessarily in a bankruptcy mode as long as you don't have irreversibility. But at some point, you see that your natural capital is going to get also damaged. And that is very important because the way we have set up our water management institutions and systems and legal frameworks is based on this assumption that water is a good to be allocated or a service to be delivered. And we do that regardless of how water is being produced, where water comes from. We don't think about that. But water is a product of a process out there that relies on our natural capital and different components of that natural capital. There's a hydrological cycle there that remains being interrupted. Climate system, it depends on forests, it depends on other components of this natural system that are natural systems that are being interrupted. And the report makes it clear that you cannot be concerned about a product of the process but then focus only about regulating that product while letting the rest of the system being interrupted and disrupted. So if you're thinking about managing water, you got to also think about those, and that's why your systems are insufficient to regulate water, because water is dependent on everything else. Why is that important? Because also it speaks about the value of water. What we talk about in this report is water being dependent on that system, but that system also being dependent on water. And that the latter is something we don't talk about. We talk about water being the downstream of the climate system, downstream of some other systems, but not talking about water being the upstream of that system. And that is extremely important because we need to do more scholarly work to establish that connection, to remind people that yes, climate crisis is a water crisis, but water crisis is also a climate crisis. Why is that important? Because an intervention in the water sector then can be intervention in climate, related to climate sector. Water mitigation becomes a climate mitigation. And that is something that we haven't spoken about enough around the world. And that connection is extremely important because we're relying on these reinforcing loops. So water system degradation is climate degradation. And I think there is not enough even scholarly work to encourage governments about more investments in the water sector, for example, to address climate change, because better soil management, better water management, better farming means climate mitigation. We speak about the other side of this story, and that's a big gap. Now, we are seeing more and more systems becoming water bankrupt. Sorry, I messed up again, or it's just the way the system works. Okay. So despite the fact that we are seeing insolvency and reversibility, the world hasn't stopped its water use. It continues to use more and more water. It continues to expand the agriculture around the world. This is global scale, not about what is happening.
By the way, we're still seeing the overlay of your version that has the wake-up call still on there. We're not seeing the full slide with the graphics of the gold and the red. Yeah, that's.
Is this making it better?
Now we're back to the right. Yeah, it looks like when you're switching slides, somehow that other screen is coming back.
Still, you're seeing both sides?
Yes, and I don't know, is it possible for you to close that? Now we're seeing the right one that you were talking about, but I don't know what'll happen next time you change, but we're seeing
I think every time we change, we have to do this again. Apologies for that. The issue is that our expenditure continues to go up, but our income is becoming more and more limited in some places. That's not global. In some places, we are seeing even increase in water budget, but we know that the timing of water flows are also is changing. We are seeing more maybe in some places rainfall than snow, for example, that affects the timing of flows, that affects our operations of reservoirs and so on. And the temperature it keeps raising, going up, rising in many places. That means more water demand for evapotranspiration even, and that means more water consumption. In some places, that means more electricity consumption for cooling. That means more hydropower need. In some places, it means more pumping of groundwater, and that means more power demand. And so you are seeing these loops, reinforcing loops, getting activated, more and more water needed, more and more even greenhouse gas emissions, because if you don't have enough hydro, then you have to go to natural gas or other fossil fuels, and then that means more emissions, more warming, and so on. Okay, so I guess you're again seeing that problem. So the report talks about one major issue, that wherever we have humanity, all continents where humanity exists, water bankruptcy exists. But the symptoms are different, very different from one location to another, or manifestations of water bankruptcy are different from one location to another. On top left of this slide, you can see the city, the water reservoir or water supply system of Chennai city in India that hit its day zero. And these day zeros are becoming more and more frequent around the world. A few months ago, my hometown city of Tehran, capital of Iran, despite the fact that it has many reservoirs, it has a lot of water transfer systems and so on, was close to its day zero. Fortunately, the rain has stopped that. So the risk is gone and people are forgetting those moments, but we are seeing these becoming more and more frequent around the world. We have seen it in Cape Town. We have seen it in some, even are seeing the risk of day zero in many places around the world, in many cities, including the United States. Top right, we are seeing Tibet, the glaciers on Tibet. Again, that's not the only place we are seeing that sort of shrinkage or collapse of glaciers. We have seen it even in Switzerland or many other places. Bottom left, something for all the Americans to remember, or all the rest of the world to remember, because Lake Mead has been in its lowest level throughout history after being operational. And that's an important message for the rest of the world, because this was very symbolic. When the Hoover Dam was built, many governments around the world, many leaders around the world got inspired. So it kind of triggered the dam building around the world and inspired more and more dam building around the world. But these reservoirs that we built to give us more resilient are now in trouble themselves. Next to it is another lake, wetland in India, suffering from water quality issues and degradation. The lake is there, but the quality issues are there. Next to it is soil degradation, soil salinization in Australia. Next to it, Lake Urumia in northwest Iran, the same story of Aral Sea, Great Salt Lakes in Utah, Salton Sea, Lake Chad, and so on. The stories are very, very, very similar. This one used to be one of the largest hypersaline lakes in the world, bigger than the Great Salt Lakes, but the story is very similar. You reduce the inflow into the lake, similar, simple mass balance. Temperature also goes up. Your water consumption continues to be there. Upstream development is there. You put your water into beneficial use, but then your ecosystem gets destroyed and you don't know how to restore it. Next to it is again land subsidence and what appears to be the impact of excessive groundwater withdrawal in Turkey. But that's not the only place in the world that we see this impact. So again, I think the issue of my slide. So we call this the issue of water bankruptcy, and we made it clear that this issue must be very different, must be considered different from a water crisis. And I hope this would be a take-home message today, that water bankruptcy is not just a metaphor. It has a scientific definition. It speaks about insolvency and irreversibility being as important as insolvency. But here, there was like I like to explain why this sort of discourse is important for policy choices, why this distinction must be recognized, and why we should talk about water bankruptcy responsibly. Just don't use it as another metaphor, because after some point, people lose sensitivity to it. When you speak about water bankruptcy, you get people thinking because they're familiar with financial bankruptcy. But financial bankruptcy is a better story, because you can go bankrupt financially, but still do better the next time you come back. We have a president who, the most powerful man of the world today, to teach us how you can come back better through transformation and accepting accepting bankruptcy. But water bankruptcy is a little different, because irreversibility is part of the story, and you can come back and still fix some of the issues, but not be as good as before. So these are some of the terms that are very familiar to us. Water stress is one of those. We keep talking about water stress. It's just a simple comparison of demand or withdrawal with the available water. You can have a high level of stress, and in many places of the world, we see that, including some of the rich states of the Middle East, but you don't suffer because stress is not the end of the world. Like our bodies, many of us are very stressed, but it's still very functional. And that indicator, which is frequently used around the world, is not telling us a good story. Because especially when we notice that some of the global South countries, some of the African states are very low in terms of stress, but that means that they're not using their water. So their water availability, natural water availability, is big. Water stress is low, but still people are suffering from water shortage. So that indicator is not very explanatory or give us a good sense of what is happening in our system. Water crisis is another term that we have been using for decades, and it has lost its value. It has lost its I would say, power in terms of the terminology, because this was supposed to give us a push for taking action and bringing all the forces out there together to do something about it. But we keep talking about it. It is there, and nothing major is happening. But what does it mean? What does it imply? This term crisis philosophically is implying a deviation from a normal state that must be an episode only. Like, it's very acute. And it has a time bound, it's an episode of deviation from normal. And if you're saying a situation is a crisis, then you are implying that going back to normal is possible through mitigation. You're implying that mitigation is the action to take. Give me a chance to dig a deeper well. Give me a chance to build one more infrastructure, one more reservoir, one desalination plant, and I can fix this. Give me one more loan. Let me use my credit line. Give me one more credit card, and I can fix this. Business as usual, because you don't have to touch the business model. You can continue doing what you were doing, borrowing more from nature and putting more and more effort into increasing supply. And that has been our model, our dominant model: increase the supply. Because in many cases, those in charge of the water sector have to deal with the exogenous factors that are being defined by others, because those in charge of the water sector, those in charge of the water districts, are not the ones who decide about the economy of the nation or the economy of a state. They're not making decisions about how to invest in AI or how to continue on urbanization. They're not the ones who decide about the composition of the economy. They're not the ones who decide about the migration policies and urbanization and other things. They don't decide on those things. They have a task. And that task is to mitigate water shortage. That's why by the time they see the signals, there is no other major effective measure but to increase supply. And sometimes, of course, you beg the consumers and users to reduce less, but that doesn't seem to be very effective. But it is important to understand that when you say we are in a crisis, we imply that mitigation is the option. Mitigation is the way to go. But here I define water bankruptcy as a post-crisis state. Water bankruptcy is a state of a failure. It's a state where, in addition to mitigation, you need to adapt to a reality, because what you thought would be an anomaly, what you thought would be a temporary deviation from normal, it's a permanent condition of your system. It's a new condition of your system. Your abnormal is actually your new normal, and some of the ecosystem functions cannot be restored. That's why you can continue talking about the Great Salt Lakes and restoration, but it's not going to happen. Sometimes it's because you don't have an engineering solution for it. If you have an extinct species, you cannot bring it back. If you have subsiding land, it's not very easy to fix that. If you have sinkholes, it's not easy to get rid of those. We don't have the engineering solution to push those things back to where they were. And sometimes we know the solution technically, but we do not know, but we cannot accomplish it because it has a huge socioeconomic cost. We cannot ask people to move out of Los Angeles or Las Vegas because development has continued and people have gone there, and then they have assets those assets have value. And the moment that we decide to do things radically, then those assets and investments can get impacted. So the socioeconomic cost of recovery or restoration would be so high that within reasonable human, I would say, timelines, we cannot fix those things. That's why, in addition to mitigation, we need adaptation. We need an adaptation to the new realities. And those new realities are sometimes very dark. You have to explain to the stakeholders, including the environmental stakeholders, that we might not be able to restore parts of the system, but that doesn't mean that we have to give up. It means that we have to accept bankruptcy today, and that is better than doing it tomorrow, because if you continue delaying this, if you continue to say this is only a crisis, this is a temporary shock, and we got to go back to where we were, you will see that the irreversibility of your system goes up, and you keep losing more and more components of your system. But if you claim bankruptcy today, you communicate to all users that you do not have enough sufficient water in the system, despite the fact that they have credible claims, they have water rights and everything. Then you have a chance to say that there is a need for a transformation, there is a need for a fresh new start. And through that, we can mitigate what can be mitigated. We can fix what can be fixed, but we can also prevent further damages. And we have to, for sure, adapt to a better reality. And that is, the fact that we cannot be nostalgic anymore, that the good old days are gone. Our business model was wrong, and we cannot restore that. And that is why we think this discourse and the shift in the discourse is necessary. And that's why we have to distinguish between these two states, because that is very important. Of course, it's sad, it's bitter, but that's the story of is it Chapter 11 in the United States? So that's the story of bankruptcy, because you have to claim bankruptcy to be able to come back with a better condition. In the case of the environment, we cannot bring all the components of the environment back, but we can address poverty alleviation. We can still continue development if we make some tough decisions. And now the last slide. Or no, not the last slide. So there is another slide, and I think this is something that is important, and that is the impacts that are being unequal, because we are not all our systems are not the same. So if you look at the impacts, the overall impacts and the overall risk of water scarcity and the implications of water bankruptcy around the world, we see that we are different from one region to another. We look at the states, the conditions of the states, nations, the numbers might be misleading, but you go down to the to certain levels of, so with some resolution, spatial resolution, you see differences. So across states, things can be very different. You can be Canada and still suffer from the risk of water bankruptcy. And as the report explains, water bankruptcy is not about how rich or poor you are financially or when it comes to the water budget. It all depends on how you manage your water. And if your expenditure is more than your available water, even if you're Alberta or Saskatchewan with plenty of water, you can run out of it. But of course, if you're Arizona and California, that might happen for you faster than other places. If you look at this map, you can see that, yes, of course, as expected, the dry areas of the world have a higher risk. But you can see some other poor areas of the world also have a high risk or implications, or like water security implications. Why? Because our resilience is different. Our tolerance against this is different. That's where you in Arizona get very much luckier than the farmers in India or the poor areas of or South America or Africa. Why? Because the economic resilience is stronger. Cities don't go bankrupt as a result of water bankruptcy. States can come in and fund and compensate and can control, can create even alternative modes of livelihood and jobs. In some other places around the world, this is not the option because 70% of the world's water is in the hands of farmers. And the moment they run out of water, that means unemployment, that means starvation, that means forced displacement, that means national security threats. Why is that important? Because we said global era of water bankruptcy. Even if you're not, your area is not threatened directly, you're being threatened through the global risk landscape that is being changed as the result of this. We all learned it in the hard way. The president of the United States decided to attack Iran. Now the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and one strait being closed is impacting the whole world because one equilibrium being disrupted has global implications. We are interconnected through trades. We are interconnected through food trades, fertilizers, but also like the climate system, the natural system, the immigration system, wars. All those things can happen in other parts of the world and still affect us. Now, what is the solution to this? The solution, I'm going to talk about it shortly, but one thing we have to understand is that if the poor of the world are going to suffer and cannot get out of this issue, then the rest of the world would suffer. But we are not equally in it because as we were not in the case of COVID-19, right? The virus, of course, if it had reached our body, it would have killed us in the same way. But to get to our body, it had a different, I think, the level of difficulty because it was easier for the virus to get to the bodies of the poor who didn't have masks, who didn't get vaccinated, who didn't have clean water to wash their hands or shelters to stay in and out of trouble. And that's the reality. The poor of the world would get away with it. The rich of the world would have an easier time, the rich nations, but within also the rich nations or poor nations, still the poor and the most vulnerable are the poor, are the rural communities, are the farming communities, and so on. Now, I talked about the dark side of this, but the report has a very, very, I would say, very promising message that we want everyone to think about and talk about. And I think those who come from the areas of the world that, the understanding of the water problem is better, have to push for this further and further. So first of all, it explains that if we want to solve the water problem.
Sorry, one more interruption. You need to move that slide off again. Yeah. There we go. Good.
Okay. So it says that we have to understand the political economy of water if we want to address this problem. The world keeps talking about providing drinking water to people. That's extremely important. The poor of the world still don't have access to water. That's humanitarian. That's the first stage of development. But there is another stage of development, and that's extremely important because we don't talk about it. And that's when farmers need to continue farming for the world to function, because if the current equilibria of the world are disrupted when it comes to food trades and food imports, then we have a major issue. Remember that food is still the biggest product of the water sector. Food is superficially cheap in the world and highly subsidized, and this must be there for the world to function. If the food prices go up, we have a lot of security issues around the world. So that is why we have a major problem here. And if we want to solve and address the water issue, then we have to address the issue of farmers and rural communities and those who make a living based on water. And that's a very, very hard thing to do for those economies that heavily rely on water for creating jobs and employment opportunities. And that is more important than food, I emphasize. Providing jobs. In many places around the world, economies are weak, and natural resources, including water, have the responsibility of providing jobs, meaning providing stability to those nations. Water bankruptcy in those places is like the end to stability. And why is that important? Because on the one hand, you have to be worried about running out of water, because the moment you run out of water, you have a national security issue. But on the other hand, if you cut water from farmers to avoid water bankruptcy, you create that national security right away today. And that's why a lot of politicians have a very hard time dealing with this problem, and they have to just remain hopeful that there would be more rainfall, and during the time they're in power, big droughts would not come and their systems don't fail. And even if a drought comes, through compensation, they can't get away with it until the next season becomes wet. So at the macro level, we need decoupling the economies from water. Remember, California's economy is huge. Agricultural water use is big, but the contribution of the agricultural sector to the overall economy of the state is not huge. This is not the case in many other places where employment and national income heavily depends on water. So at the macro level, we need a decoupling, and decoupling means diversification of the economy. We need more investment in the growth in the service sector and in the industrial sector, so that some of these farmers who are farming, I would say they don't benefit from advanced farming practices, unlike the American farmers, can get their employment opportunities and sources of income in alternative sectors. And if you do that, then you can think about industrializing the agriculture sector and producing more food with less water, less land under cultivation. But that is only possible provided that you can find alternative modes of livelihood. How is that possible? It becomes possible if we help them through investments in their industrial sector and service sector, so they can diversify their economies. And we need to provide technology to them, both for improving their ag sector and water sector and their other sectors. Of course, technology can also be used on the supply side, so and the demand side, improve efficiency while thinking about the Jevons paradox and the issues that can come with increased efficiency, but recycling and reuse, regenerative agriculture, and many, many, many other things. But this is impossible if you don't provide finance and money to them. The other thing, though, we can do is, in this fragmented world, we have fights between political parties within countries, right and left, and then fight between the countries in the global north and the global south. The world is very fragmented. That's a reality. Water is one of those very few topics that we can all agree to its importance. Whether you're a rural, in a rural constituency or in an urban constituency, water should matter to you. Whether you're America first or not, water must matter to you. Indeed, if you're America first, water must matter to you when it comes to national security and production at home. But water is also the issue of the Global South. The Global South has been talking about it, coming to the table of negotiations, climate change negotiations, asking us why we're not talking about water. So water can become a uniting factor to align national security concerns with international priorities on poverty alleviation, on addressing hunger, on health improvement of health conditions, on addressing inequity issues, gender equality, improvement of the fulfillment of human rights and justice in the world. So water is a denominator there, but also water is very much related to other the focus of the Rio Conventions and other environmental issues that get often more attention than water, like climate change, like biodiversity loss, like sometimes even desertification, because they're interrelated. And remember that we claim that water is the upstream and downstream of those things. So an investment in water can mean an investment in climate mitigation. So sometimes then we can think about putting a dollar instead of in a solar panel into better farming and better improvement of the water sector, and that narrative is currently missing. So in a fragmented world, that some of those those issues like carbon tax or climate change policies can be dividing. Why not speaking about water? And if you have the Republicans who care about the farmers, let's talk about that. Let's talk about water and remind them of the importance of this and think about how to use this opportunity. And when is the best time? Better time than 2026, where we have the third water conference, where next month we gather in New York to talk about the progress on the SDG 6. We had also the May Dushanbe Water Conference, and then there would be other events, and then into 2028 and other major events. And one thing before I finish this, first of all, the full decoupling from water is impossible. So we have to reduce reliance on water, of course, but because there is no dry activity in the world, and that reminds us how important water is. But the other issue is that without proper accounting, we cannot really address the issue. You all know from the Colorado River Treaty and the history and all of that, why accounting and having a good understanding of how much water you really have is a first step. But one thing we see around the world when working with states, when member states and those groups who are in conflicts, is that there is no proper accounting and transparency there. With satellite tools, with AI and other things, we can do a much better job than before when it comes to accounting. But that's the first step when it comes to addressing bankruptcy and bleeding. We got to protect the poor. We got to understand that and respect and advocate for the rights of the farmers and the poor and the indigenous communities and the rural communities. And we have to make sure that the world understands that the path to addressing water bankruptcy, but also environmental sustainability, is through the empowerment of the farmers and rural communities. And they're the savior of the planet. And we have to respect that and understand that, because the role they play is enormous in securing that future. But we have to remind the decision makers, environmental activists, different groups, of why a better farming, a better soil management, better water management addresses all the concerns they have, so we don't make farmers feel marginalized around the world, but included in the conversation. So let me thank this with also thanking you and all other partners involved in this, all those who have helped and contribute to the report or the promotion of the report around the world in academia and media and so on. The Women in Water Diplomacy Network, a great partner. Sharon is an active member of it, and our institute is a great supporter of it. And I'll be happy to take questions now. I hope you get a chance to read this report, not before bed, but at another time, and you talk about the positive side of it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Lots of applause. Wonderful presentation. We put the link, I think at least maybe 15, 20 minutes ago in the chat. If you haven't read the report, I really strongly encourage you to do so. It's very clear, not long. That's right. We said, it's succinct. It makes the points and has some great graphics. So really a great presentation. Thank you so much. We're honored that you took the time after traveling all over the world. You just got back, and thank you for scheduling this. We have a few questions that have come in. And a couple of them relate to something that's Chapter 4 in your report is governing global water bankruptcy. And you talked some about issues of governance, but a couple of questions have come up about whether we do have too siloed a governance framework, whether the past systems of governance, aren't equipped for, dealing with this water bankruptcy situation. Could you spend a couple minutes talking about kind of your findings and recommendations when it comes to kind of this whole question of water governance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair question. I think we set it up front that what we have is not equipped to deal with the current situation. And part of this is because our legal systems, our institutions have been built on this assumption of water being a good or a service to be delivered and allocated, right? So everything we have is based on that. And we set up our institutions based on that assumption and based on the conditions that no longer exist on when it comes to the socioeconomic conditions, but also the natural conditions, right? We built our reservoir based on some maximum flows when it comes to flooding. Now, when it comes to flooding, some of the reservoirs we built are inadequate, but they're empty in other periods throughout the year. We sign agreements based on that. Some agreements, international treaties like the Indus Treaty, for example, between Pakistan and India, we taught them in class as the most resilient in institutional settings and transboundary settings, but they are now being threatened because the conditions have changed. And yes, the issue of fragmentation is also there, but how can we fix this realistically as long as our understanding of the problem is different? I think part of it is the institutional setting and the fragmented governance, and we can talk about how theoretically that can be fixed. But do we also have a good understanding of the water problem? What is even a definition of the water problem that we are trying to solve? To be honest, I think that is also a missing thing. Are we talking about water supply? Are we talking about what sort of utility do we have from water? And if we think about that, and to be, if you're fair, the problem of water is its diversity, our diversity of our needs, the diversity of the problems, diversity across zones, diversity across time within the same year. Our problems can jump from one thing to another. Between years, we can jump from one thing to another. So then we don't, the societies are not continuously sensitive to one thing, and the sense of urgency fluctuates. And that's an important thing. The very first thing I wrote after coming back from politics to academia was a paper, and I can share the link with you, was about how valuable some crises are to the policymakers to take an action because they reduce the political cost of action. Imagine, ask yourself whether California could have started monitoring groundwater if they didn't have the crazy drought of the 2014 and that time. And how come a place so advanced in terms of technology and money and all of that, we didn't even have the means of legally monitoring those things. So the cost that drops, but it's also not meaningful to, I would say it's very naive to think that we're going to lift political boundaries and then have one river base, set our boundaries on decisions based on the boundaries of river basins. That's a good thing in theory, and coordination, of course, is needed. But it's also we're not going to have countries unite or provinces or states unite because of the water boundaries. I think that's naive. We can advocate for coordination and transparency, but at the end of the day, that's not going to happen. So a lot of things we read in academia, then it's about integrated water resource management. And that language has been there for 40 years, 50 years. We keep talking about it. And we do a big modeling exercise, a lot of computations. And if you read the conclusion of all the papers written, at the end, everyone makes the same conclusion, regardless of how advanced their models or computations were. We all end with that. And if we then we have to ask why that computation was even necessary to come to a conclusion that we knew from day one. So politics is important, and integration would not happen, because if you think about integration, then it means we have to integrate everything, right? Water, energy, agriculture, health, defense. And it's impossible. Then you need a benevolent dictator in charge of the system. That's a myth. And that's why we see around the world, some governance systems are very distributed and still work. You go to Florida, you have the water districts, and you go to California and you have a state water, state water department. And the United States doesn't have a federal water entity. Canada just built a federal water entity, still has jurisdictional issues. The states are not listening to it. They don't even question the legitimacy of this. So we don't have one formulation to say that build this governance model and you will solve your problem, as we don't have a formulation for how democracy can be created, how equality and equity can be created. So we can talk about some best practices and things like that, but in one places you can have a very distributed system that is super functional, and in another system maybe a benevolent dictator who's doing well, but it doesn't mean that you can copy this model from this place to the other place and it works. So I think that's one thing there, and I think this sort of appreciation and missing the fact that it's a political economy problem. Water management problem is a political economy problem. I don't think that's part of the narrative. It's certainly not the narrative of the United Nations. We ignore and dismiss the fact that the poor of the world rely on this, and governments in the world, governments in the global south are incapable of addressing this issue. And if they decide to implement some of the generic, suggestions that we in academia make, like removing subsidies, actually we're going to get hurt in the global north, because imagine what happens if the food prices change. So if even there are political interests in maintaining the status quo in many places, and we should not be naive about those.
Yeah. And you touched on something that was in an earlier question, and I'm not going to go back to it, but somebody did raise a question that talked about the right, let's say, scale of the governance regime. And some people think it should be at the river basin, but then, you've got groundwater at much more localized levels. And so you pointed out that in and of itself is a challenge. What is the level, at what scale should you have the governance happening? So you covered that question. So Ali, we usually take the questions in the chat. So if it's possible to put your question in the chat, I'd appreciate it. But I'll call on you after I bring up another issue that came up in an early question. And it has to do with, you started out talking about the checking account, the savings account. And if you look at kind of the flow of income and the balance sheet, and you talked about the natural capital, right? And so some of the natural systems being on the supply side, and somebody asked a question about, well, what about the water needs of that system? Does that go on the demand side? So could you maybe talk a little bit about the natural capital systems as you kind of conceptualized them?
Wonderful question. And I think, it depends on how you it doesn't matter where you put it, but we have to recognize it, right? So you want to put it on the supply side and say, okay, we have less supply, or you want to put it in the demand side and say we have to allocate it. But the reality is that insolvency itself becomes possible by stealing the share of nature. And water, even greenness creates this perception that we have more water. Sometimes I argue that because you're green, it doesn't mean you have much more water. The needs of your environment is also greater because you're greener. And if you're in a yellowish region, maybe your system requires less water. So it's an extremely important thing not providing water to to the natural capital itself is degrading the whole system. And that's why the whole freshwater budget for the freshwater availability gets impacted by stealing the share of nature. But that's the silent stakeholder, and we have been very good in stealing it or miscalculating it or not even counting it, because even we have the legal system that talks about beneficial use, water law, and some of those things that don't even some of the systems that don't think about that water belonging to nature or being needed to maintain the equilibrium.
Yeah. So Ali, I'll let you ask your question, but typically we don't have people unmute just because we have a backlog, but go ahead. We're patient there.
Well, I just wanted to say welcome to Kaveh, virtually showing up here. Hopefully we can invite him to come in person. We have a long history of friendship, so that's why. So I had a question, very quick question, but if the time is limited, I can postpone it. But my question was basically when you talk about bankruptcy, it reminded me of diabetes, and we have pre-diabetes and diabetes. And if you go to the pre-diabetes, we can return a steal, but when you go to diabetes, you cannot return. I thought maybe this is the situation, but governments usually try to postpone issuing bankruptcy, right? Because nobody wants to, kind of, use the accountability of having a bankruptcy in their governance or that period of thing. How is there any mechanism that can encourage people to issue a bankruptcy? Because I know the importance of doing that, but issuing that is not easy.
Yeah, very, very good question, and good to see you, Ali. And we all both come from a dry region, and you ended up in a dry region. At least I migrated to a place that has more water. But the problem you mentioned, and thanks for giving me a good example. I use cancer. It's a more bitter one, and I say if you're a cancer patient, like if I'm sometimes when I get criticized for killing hope, I say, look, like if I'm your patient and I have cancer, tell me in the early stages because yes, I can never be that healthy person again. But if I accept that I have cancer, I have to go through a painful and expensive treatment plus process, I might have a chance of saving my body and not collapsing. But if I keep denying this and delaying this, then I'm in that stage. Now, when it comes to, as you said, political discourse is not about that. They don't want to do that. They prefer the mitigation language. They prefer the crisis language in discourse because mitigation then becomes big projects, big allocations. It means less into spending less effort into cutting demand and consumption, which is extremely important in bankruptcy management. Then delaying this is the best strategy, and it works. And unfortunately, the only mechanism available to beat that is nature. So if nature decides to give us 5 years of drought in a row, then we can do a better job because we are forced into making a decision. But that's the issue of urgency, which I mentioned, and I'm going to share that report, that paper with you. So actually, I use the Eisenhower matrix for that. We hear that the president was using this to prioritize his daily tasks, and it was about urgency and importance. So I argue that a matter would be handled in governance if it's both very urgent relatively and very, very important. Unfortunately, water is never the most important or the most urgent thing for any society. And the more trouble you have and the more parallel problems you have, the less important and urgent it becomes. That's why a crisis can all of a sudden create a sense of urgency. Now, if you compare water with climate change, you can even say that because of the investment we have made in research and promoting the problem of climate change, many societies feel more urgency when it comes to climate change, and not water. And they don't even see the connection. So how do we disrupt that? By talking about this, by talking about the problem, by establishing the connection, by also creating opportunities for people to get rewarded, including the policymakers. That my point is that, okay, your policymaker doesn't like to hear about climate change. Talk to that person about water, because the entry point can be different, but the action or the impact would be the same, and it would benefit everybody. And I think that's a missing thing. If you think about the literature, the scientific literature, how many papers do we have that talk about the impacts of climate on water? How many papers do we have that talk about the water impact on climate? And tell me why we haven't done that as water scholars writing about the other side of this equation, which is much more relevant and actually urgent, and where you can see tangible impacts, because the impacts when it comes to water improvements, livelihood of farmers, livelihood of poor communities, the impacts are much more tangible and quicker to obtain than some of those things that are long-term issues in a way, but there are also political interests when it comes to renewable fossil energy like EVs and so on, and those are also realities that don't exist in the water game, or at least they're different.
Thank you.
So this has been a great discussion, and we have a few more minutes here, but I want to build upon this very last discussion, because I have to admit that, well, I was going to ask you a question first, but I'll admit first that I'm not sure it's obvious to me. I can think about the steps along the way on this water impact on climate. Okay, so I wonder if that's something you can help elaborate on in your work going forward, so that you carry that message forward and help us understand that. But I wanted to ask you the question from your work at UN University, which is part of the UN. You are called UN University because you are a part of the UN. I had the pleasure of walking the streets of New York with you and having you explain to me what UN University is and how it works, and I appreciate that. But very often, what I hear about, I don't go to the COP meetings. I don't go to the big UN climate meetings. And what I hear there is that water doesn't get enough attention at these meetings, and that there may be a water pavilion and so forth. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that water isn't getting enough attention at these global discussions? And I'm not talking about the UN Water Conference itself, but I keep hearing it's much like the groundwater people. The groundwater people always say, within the water realm, the surface water, the rivers are getting much more attention than the groundwater. What I'm asking you is it your perception that water is not getting enough attention in these global discussions of climate? And if you think it's not, do you have suggestions about how to address that?
Absolutely. I think, and we say that even the report says this, water is a marginal issue. We don't have an entity within the UN to deal with water, right? Dedicated entity. We have that for food, we have that for health, we have that even for the environment, but nothing for water. Governments have many places, many places around the world have taken water, taken it for granted. And indeed, there is a reality there. Every nation has water. We don't have a physical, complete physical shortage of water, but we have a shortage of cheap water, right? Water is becoming more and more expensive to use and withdraw. And water has not been the issue of concern for the global north and those states that shape the global politics and narratives. And that's an extremely important thing. And that's why even the discussions we have had about water are very much biased toward WASH, health and sanitation issues, and not the other things we see, like integrated water resource management as part of the SDG 6, but not enough about the political economy water, not that water that is hidden in, and the role it plays in the economic stability. I was a negotiator for climate change at some point, and one of my first criticisms of the Paris Agreement was, where is water? And let's talk about water. So water is sidelined. The world was mute on water. Was it 1977 that we had the first UN Water Conference? Then till 2023, no UN Water Conference. That tells you how important water has been. Then now 26, next one 28. So we talk about it, but still we have to compete with climate change by the Rio Conventions, and that connection that we are talking about is not there. Are we talking about better water management, meaning mitigation of heat islands in urban environments? Are we talking about better condition of water systems, mean less climate, less contribution to warming in certain regions of the world? Are we talking about how better soil management can help with carbon sequestration? Or we always say, let's invest in EVs, let's invest in public transport, let's invest in renovating, urban environments and so on. So I don't think we talk about it and we understand the value of the opportunities we have. And I think the way to change it is to think and talk differently, to come up with narratives that are different. And that the narratives then, to an extent, can capture the concerns of different people. The problem of water though, is I used to teach, test this in a classroom, making role playing with people, representatives of different nations, and we're asking them to come up with a statement, one-page statement that captures all the problems and talks about action. And then you have the global South and North together. They cannot conclude because the actions they ask for are extremely different, and some of the actions they ask for means cause for the rest of them. So the diversity of the problem makes it extremely challenging. But if we talk about it and we talk about those opportunities, I think we can make a huge difference. And I don't think the National Science Foundation, NOAA, NASA, like those would catch up quickly, but I think we can push them to catch up and think about these things differently. Also fund us for doing things that talks about the other side of this equation and make our people also be a bit more critical of the dominant narratives that we have that somehow convinced people, and I'm not saying anything against climate change here, but if we have convinced people that climate change is the cause of all problems, all environmental problems, including water problems, or is the most important environmental problems or side effect of sustainable development, something is wrong with our science, because that is not true. And if you do something for something else that is not climate change, you would still help climate change mitigation. So then if you adopt that lens, then the entry points can be different. And then you have political opportunities. I had the task of writing the Green Recovery Report for UNEP, and this was like a task that we had to bring all the focal points of the UN system together and talk about how after COVID-19 we have to do green recovery. And then a lot of inputs were EVs, transport, energy sector, and so on. And I remember some folks were fighting also for investment in natural capital and saying that's where you can get quick return, right? Impact livelihoods immediately, and then benefit the rest of the world. But then they're hidden from us. Even let's say when you're thinking about gender equity, how many times do you think about delivering it through water? How many think about, when you're talking about human rights or stability or peace building, we're thinking about water as the medium of delivery. I don't think there's enough of work, research, narrative, evidence to prove that that's a good choice. And an investment in water is an investment in national security, investment in all those things. UN University has taken one step in that direction. We continue to advocate for it, and we rely on your help and contribution to take that, I would say, message further to other communities and promote it.
Well, I look forward to continuing to interact, dialogue, work with you. I would like to say something that really came through in your presentation that we often don't get integrated. In the introduction, I talked about how you integrate, you do this interdisciplinary integrative work, but you really did talk about agriculture and food production and the stability related to that. And so I think that is a somewhat different side of the story than we sometimes hear about in these discussions too. And I know that some from our agricultural community in Arizona tuned in today and was aware of the seminar. And so I hope what you said resonated broadly with all of the community. I'll just then, in closing, underscore Ali's suggestion that we figure out a way to get you here to Arizona. We have a lot to show, not just at the university here, but in our natural landscape. And we're at the border with Mexico, so we have transboundary issues that we are dealing with and so forth. So maybe we can put our heads together and figure out when your calendar might open up a little bit so that you could come visit us here. But I want to thank you. Thank you for even going over time a few minutes. And I hope you can get some rest from all your travels. And I look forward to seeing you in Stockholm when you're awarded the Stockholm Water Prize by the King and Queen of Sweden. It's quite an exciting thing. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Look forward to visiting you and learning more about the best practices in Arizona. Just before I conclude, because I happened to see a question about cloud seeding. So I think that's a supply side supply side intervention. I'm not convinced it's a fundamental solution. We all know the history and all of that. I encourage more and more research into it, but without addressing the issues of consumption, providing more water, as my research over the past 2 decades has shown, is just encouraging further and further development and further increase in consumption. Also, now we also see a lot of debates about AI and data centers being good and bad, and there are lots of clashes and so on. I think we also have to be very careful that there, as one of the one of the co-authors of the report that came out last week and has made a lot of noise about the water footprint of AI. I should say that at the end of the day, societies actually need to make a decision about the composition of their economies. And you have to, at some point, make a decision whether you want to put a drop of water in producing cucumber or alfalfa or data. And data can be much more, it can give you a better return on investment. But the question is whether all those people who would lose their right would benefit from it or not. That's the fundamental issue of justice. So improved productivity is something that we should welcome, as long as it doesn't compromise justice, food security, stability, and some of those other issues. And I think it's important to also think about it and be less emotional and think about these fundamental issues that we need to address. Good luck with everything, and looking forward to
Well,
working
thank
with
you so much. Thank you. Look forward to further interactions. Good
Thank you.
afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.